Kevin Moorhead. I'm chair of the Department of Environmental Studies. The department's pleased to welcome today Werner Vornos, winner of the 2003 United Nations Population Award. Mr. Vornos has been described as the foremost spokesperson on global population issues. He's president of the Population Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit public interest group. He's a distinguished administrator. He's held several national and state positions. He's also served 4 years as a Maryland state legislator. Mr. Vornos is a recognized expert in world population issues. He's been president of the Population Institute for over 20 years. He's addressed several plenary sessions of the United Nations conferences. He has a long list of honors and awards throughout his distinguished career. As an example, the Order of Merit, the highest distinction granted by the German government to a non-German citizen in recognition of humanitarian efforts. Mr. Vornos makes frequent national television and radio appearances. He contributes regularly to magazines and newspapers such as the Washington Post and the New York Times. He's also author of a book, Gaining People, Losing Ground. Mr. Vornos has dedicated his energies and talents to addressing a variety of people, including college students, members of civic organizations, and U.S. and UN officials, pressing for what he calls rational and humane solutions to the population problem. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Werner Vornos.
Thank you, Dr. Moorhead. I'm delighted to be here at UNC Asheville. I haven't been here since, I don't know, when I visited the Cherokee burial grounds probably 20 years ago. And as I prepared to come down, with 21 speeches scheduled in 3.5 days in North Carolina, I followed these storms, and much to my amazement, I saw they were hitting Asheville. Storms don't hit Asheville, but here you had 2 floods in 1 week. And the big news we got in the Washington area was that Highway 40 is closed. And when we finally called the AAA, they said, well, it's to the east. You won't have to worry about it. And we came down 81 to 77 and down 40. Dr. Moorhead, I want to thank you for that introduction and not making the mistake that a very excited Rotarian made this morning when he introduced me at the country club for the morning meeting of the Rotarians in the Asheville area. He got to the title of my book, and as some of us get excited when we give introductions, he says, Werner's written the kind of book that once you lay it down, you never pick it up again. With recommendations like that, you know. I do want to take the time that I have this morning to just talk to you about a subject that doesn't affect people as bold as I am, but it certainly affects you in every facet of your life. How many of you are under 24? Congratulations. Because for the first time in the history of the world, we have 1 billion young people between age 15 and 24. Most of them just about the end of their reproductive years. And so how will you handle that awesome responsibility of parenting, having only the number of children that you can love and take care of and raise to responsible adulthood will mean the difference between you having a better quality of life, all of us having a better quality of life on this planet, or one where we're headed towards an environmental Armageddon. We're now at 6.4 billion people. And it's not that we're sexier than any previous generation that's causing the problem. What's happened is we've conquered death as a result of medical breakthroughs, mass inoculation campaigns, sanitary improvements. We've brought down the death rates, but we haven't done an equally good job in bringing down the fertility levels. When I drove last night to the other college in town, I went past more cows than I've seen most of my stretch of land since I left the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And I said, you know, some of you must think, why is this person coming down here to speak to us about population problems? That's because we live in a demographically divided world. Here in North Carolina, we have a population of about 8 million people. But if you were to scan the globe and look for a country that's similar in size to North Carolina, you would probably focus on that Southeast Asian country of Bangladesh. Bangladesh already has 148 million people living in that smaller space. And between now and 2030 or 2040, Bangladesh is going to double to over 300 million people. and with it comes extreme poverty, further social disintegration, and decline in social status. Poverty is a mean thing to behold, but so is what we as human beings do to this environment of ours. It took all of recorded history, just to show you how we got this way, all of recorded history for us on this planet to have the first billion people. By 1930, we went to 2 billion. By 1960, 3 billion. 1975, 4 billion. 1986, 5 billion. By 1999, we'd gone over 6 billion, and today, as I mentioned, we're at 6.4 billion, growing annually by about 77 million people. That's down from where it was in the mid-'80s, when it was around 80 and 90 million a year. But still, it leaves a significant heavier footprint upon the environment. Things aren't very reassuring in the world when you look at the environment. Our forests are declining, our topsoil is eroding, our deserts are expanding, our global climate is changing radically, and we're looking at resource shortages, especially in areas of food and water. Let me try to examine those for a moment and then leave you with some suggested solutions before we go to questions and answers this morning. When I said our forests are declining, the most prohibitive and visual observance of the declining forests is what we're doing to our tropical rainforests, where so much of our biological diversity of plant and animal life resides. And we already have wreaked havoc upon the rainforests to the point where 50% of all remaining rainforests in the world are now in 3 countries. They're in Indonesia, the 4th most populous country in the world today. They are in Brazil, in our hemisphere, the 5th most populous country, and in Zaire, the Congo. What's instructive about those 3 countries is none of them have adopted a conservation policy yet. However, what is lost to us when we look at the deforestation problem in the world is the fact that 70% of all third world families depend upon wood as their sole source of fuel. And how are you going to tell an impoverished person that they can't use the wood that's available to them to cause warm food and shelter and to be able to protect themselves against the elements when you're living on less than $2 a day, as half of the world today does? So not only are we looking at a very youthful population, but we're also seeing an escalating level of poverty in the world. And that poverty is as far removed as when I gave that example of Bangladesh, but it's not something that it will escape any of us, because given the globalization of the economy, the instant transportation system. I was in Wuhan last week, the capital city of Hubei province in China. It's the beginning of the Yangtze River. By the way, it too was flooded and lost about 149 lives to the flooding along the Yangtze River, which was supposed to have been prevented forever by the building of the Three Gorges Dam, which would divert water and thereby prevent that phenomenon from ever occurring again. When you look at 99% of the population growth today occurring in the poorest countries, you can see why it causes such a havoc with the environment. We in the industrialized world are very fortunate. We have stabilized our population. For instance, the average American family today has 2 children per family. In many of the European countries, you're down to below replacement level. Italy, for instance, is down to 1.2 children per family. Spain is at 1.3 children per family and would even be lower than Italy if it wasn't for the gypsy population, which is having on average of 6 to 8 children. But the Spanish families have all now gone below 1.1 and 1 child per family. So the industrialized world, the richest part of the world, has stabilized its population. Between now and 2050, we will probably see only 55 million Europeans and Australians, New Zealanders, Japanese, Canadians, and Americans being born. But if you think that that means that the world population problem is over, then I submit to you that you're coddling the comfortable and ignoring the afflicted. What do I mean by that? Well, in this same period where we in the industrialized world are adding 55 million, the poorest parts of the world, those already terribly torn by civil strife and social unrest, and where all too many people live in brutal poverty, are adding 2.6 billion people in the same time. When you realize the greatest sufferer in that kind of population growth rate is women, you'll see that it's not just the environment that suffers, but we as human beings suffer as a result of deprivation and increasing poverty. I mentioned to you that the second biggest environmental disaster we're facing is loss of topsoil. We now are in possession of technological equipment that can measure windborne and waterborne erosion of soil. And last year alone, the Earth Institute has told us that we lost 26 billion tons of topsoil in 1 year. We lost it primarily due to three reasons. Number one is urbanization. Number two is marginal farming. And number three is expanding deserts. Urbanization, all of us will at one time or another feel the brunt of, whether it's 85,000 in Asheville, or as most of you will wind up in some metropolitan area, you will feel the effects of urbanization. Today, half of the world's residents live in cities. Half of the world's residents. By 2020, that'll climb to about 2/3 of the world's population. And even though New York's population and Los Angeles' population is at the moment in the top 10 cities of population statistics, by 2020, New York and Los Angeles will have disappeared, and the top 10 cities will look like a terrorist hit list. Bombay, India; Karachi, Pakistan; Dhaka, Bangladesh; Jakarta, Indonesia; Lagos, Nigeria, and it goes on. Bombay alone is estimated to be a population by 2020 of 28.5 million people. And already you have 6 million people of that population who live on the street, no shelter, lucky if they have a newspaper to put over them at night. And so the problem of urbanization is very real. Even though the inhabitants of these cities they occupy only 2% of the world's land area, but they use 2/3 of the world's resources, and they provide 75% of the world's garbage, which has to be disposed of somewhere, usually in the rural countryside. So urbanization will get our attention. And it's the neon signs and the bright lights that attract us. Jobs are there. We think that we're going to get ourselves out of our rural misery of poverty. And we've overplowed so many of the rural countrysides throughout the world and overpumped the groundwater that they are in many cases water distressed. And so, yes, the neon signs and the colorful lights of the cities keep drawing us, thinking we're going to find a better quality of life. Marginal farming is a very real phenomenon in that having to feed 6.4 billion people, are moving ever more into areas to plow and to till that shouldn't be disturbed, because when the great rains come, as they still do, as we've just seen recently, topsoil gets washed away, and it causes tremendous soil erosion. A classic example of that is the Royal Kingdom of Nepal, located in the Himalayas. People hard-pressed for enough fuel to feed the population, to heat the population during the severe winters that they have, are cutting down trees ever higher into the Himalayas, and farmers needing new land to grow crops on, because Nepal is one of those 90 countries that are doubling in 60 years, their population. So they go till areas that shouldn't be disturbed, areas the size of that table as it goes up the Himalayan hillside, and planting seeds, cutting away the underbrush, not realizing that they're disturbing nature's buffer zone. And when they finally come to the peak growing season and the monsoon rains come, as they still do annually in that part of the world, the greatest export from Nepal becomes its topsoil, as it goes cascading down the 4 major riverways that have their headwaters in Nepal. and flooding areas in India the size of about Missouri and Ohio, and then eventually winding up in the basement of the subcontinent, which is Bangladesh. And some of you may have seen on the evening news the terrible conditions that exist when Bangladesh gets flooded, as it does now, every year with regularity. They have nothing to do with the marginal farming that's taking place 1,000 miles away from them, but they are the bearer of the ecological disaster that then visits the land. And I guess what it demonstrates to us that environmentally we've become a world without borders. Burning bad coal in England affects the salmon industry in Norway, as acid rain pollutes about 20% of the hatchery stock. And we, for instance, if we have open dump fires in Juarez, Mexico, with everything being burned and soot put into the air, it's the people of El Paso who get the fallout from the soot and the terrible pollution that comes with it. So we find ourselves being faced with ever more environmental problems that have global consequences, but we have no real control over it. An example, of course, is the Kyoto Accords that was hammered out. 109 countries have now signed on to the Kyoto Accord to try to curb carbon dioxide and other trace gas emissions from the atmosphere in order to slow down the global climate change that we're experiencing. But as you know, the Bush administration has chose to withdraw the United States from being one of the signatories to that pact, which is now by 109 countries, and because it would affect the American economy. None of the other 109 who have banned these terrible gases, or curbed them at least, and started trading carbon dioxide emissions for clean air, have seen an economic downturn, but we are one of the very few that have exempted ourselves from joining the global effort to bring environment into the kind of priority that it deserves. When we look at the dust that now creeps into Washington State, Oregon, and California, you just cleaned your house last Saturday, and here you are on Friday again feeling an orange dust over your furniture. That's not anything that comes out of the Pacific Ocean. That comes out of the Gobi Desert in China, which is the fastest spreading desert of any desert area in the world. And here you have a nation of 1.3 billion people. And as those desert winds whip up and find very little to stop them, even though China has, in the last year alone, planted 18 million trees, hardwood trees, to try to arrest the speed with which the desert is blowing away topsoil, it's going to take a long time before they can recover. And the desert is now about 150 kilometers from Beijing. On the western side of our continent, the terrible disasters that we're just facing, with 7 named hurricanes hitting us this year, and the National Weather Service saying that there's another 7 in the wake before the hurricane season is over, has its origin in the fact that we have deforested the fastest growing continent in the world. Africa has lost almost all of its forests, and desert in Africa is spreading at a rate of 6 miles of new desert from Mauritania in the west to Djibouti in the east, longitudinally spreading deserts. Trees have come down first, topsoil is being blown away, and so there's nothing in the wake of the heavy winds that come out of the Sahara when they hit the Atlantic Ocean to slow them down, as there used to be barriers that we had planted around our farms and others to interrupt windbreaks and build windbreaks to slow down the weather. And so they pick up tremendous speed as they come across the Atlantic, and then they make landfall either in the Caribbean or in Central America, or as the last 4 have done, in the United States. It's become a world without borders, and environmentally we're able to document that. I mentioned to you climate change, and got a little bit into that when I started talking about the Kyoto document that has been adopted by countries like Canada and Russia. But it's going to take an awful lot of effort to reduce the carbon dioxide gases that we are dependent upon as we rely on fossil fuels as our prime source of fuel. And with us growing every year, the world's population, China, for instance, now is adding more automobiles, more new automobiles than the last 5 years of United States automobile manufacturing. Ford just opened its third motor plant in China. Buick is dominating the market in Shanghai. Volkswagen, Toyota, even a Korean manufacturer has got a massive operation. And of course, you can see the interrelationship and what will happen when you have all these Chinese switching from bicycles to motorized transportation, and what comes with it when you have to consume tremendous fuel. 1.3 billion Chinese looking for additional output by the gasoline and oil industry in the world. It's a vicious cycle, and one that's very real for the future. It isn't a problem for people as bald as I am, who've done a very poor job in managing the global economy and the global environment, but it will be a problem for all of you, because I expect many of you will be part of the new leadership that has to come to grips with these issues. It's about our children and our grandchildren and what kind of future we're going to leave them. Climate change, there's some who say we need to study it some more, and that's the reason we shouldn't sign on to something like the Kyoto Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, for the last 15 years, the world has experienced the 14 hottest years in recorded history. It would have been 15 years, except for Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. When that eruption occurred and put an aerosol parasol over the world, we were shielded against the rays of the sun for 1 year. And so it wasn't another record-setting year. But we're looking at each of the years, including what we're now looking at this year, as we about to end October. Globally, we have already set a new record in temperatures, and we're also setting records as far as water shortages and water-stressed areas are concerned. But before I turn to water, there are alternative fuels out there that we can make greater reliance on, whether it's windmills or whether it's solar energy, that are working quite well in various parts of the world, including in the United States, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where you have significant wind power on Lake Superior. We've built over 50,000 windmills to produce energy. When you come from Los Angeles to Palm Desert and Palm Springs, you come through the mountain pass and you see a forest of windmills just whirring away very quietly, and in clean energy being produced. It's a matter of us getting control of the oil lobby and making sure that the people's lobby is much stronger and says, we want alternative fuels that are clean, that are safe, and that are inexpensive, that we can remove the tremendous barrier that we have to being reliant upon foreign oil. Finally, I wanted to mention 2 areas of resource shortages that are driven not only by people, but also by the environment. One is food. Tonight, some 800 million people on the planet will go to bed hungry, not knowing where they're going to get food from tomorrow. If you are privileged enough, as many of us are, to click onto the computer, I recommend for you a website called FAO.org. FAO.org stands for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the World. Its headquarters is in Rome, and it will list you the 86 countries that are today unable to feed their populations, nor do they have enough money to buy enough food on the global food markets. So the food situation is very real. Cereal prices are going to a record this year because of failed production to keep pace with demand. And we'll grumble about it when we go into the grocery store. I went into one this morning called Ingles. I always get amazed when I get into another state where all these grocery stores are coming from. But it's very simple. There's demand. And the woman behind the counter was telling me that cereal prices in North Carolina have increased this year alone by about 20%. We grumble a little bit about it. But if they increase by 20% in Cairo, Egypt, you have food riots. And if you're in one of these 86 countries that are unable to feed their populations, a whole government can fall over shortage of food and price of food. So 800 million going tonight to bed, not knowing where they're going to get a decent meal from tomorrow. The one crisis that will affect all of us in this room is water. We have somehow been mesmerized by the pictures that we keep being sent from outer space, starting as far back as John Glenn sending back these beautiful Earth shots showing the globe enveloped in water, and not realizing that 97% of that water is salt water. So today we have 3% of the world's water that could be used for human consumption, but 2% of that is in the polar ice caps in the other frozen areas of the world. And so 6.4 billion people are dependent upon 1% of the world's water. We can always find a substitute for oil, but we can't find a substitute for water because 70% of our bodies is made up of water. So it's the lifeblood, the dependency for us to survive by having enough access to fresh water. And even today, as we speak, there are 1,500,000,000 people in the world who lack access to clean water. And so waterborne diseases are still one of the major contributing forces to infant mortality in the world. What about solutions to this problem? I mean, it isn't the good Lord that's destroying the environment and it's threatening our resource base. It's human numbers. And this is not one of the insoluble problems. We can solve the population problem. And I want to leave you today with 4 suggestions. First, I want to start out by telling you that there are today some 350 million women in the world who have told credible demographic health surveys that they want no more children. Many of them didn't want their last pregnancy, or they want to space time in between pregnancies to protect the life of the mother and the infant, but they lack the education and the affordable means to do anything about it. So empowering them will see us stabilize world population, not at the current prediction of the United Nations, which is about 8.9 billion, but at 8 billion. Still considerably a heavier footprint on the environment than what we have today, but it's one that's more manageable. It will still mean that we'll have to change our consumption patterns, especially the industrialized world, which makes up only 20% of the world's population, but uses 80% of the world's resources. So when you say, what does all this have to do with me? We are part of the problem. And when we overconsume, as most of us in this room will admit that we do, then we do contribute to the resource shortages that are facing so many of the fellow human beings on this planet. The water crisis is very real, and it's not something that's far away. 86 places in the United States are now water stressed, including Southern Oregon, Northern California, Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. Nevada, with Las Vegas, the fastest growing city in the United States, is drying up, having to put in rationing measures and get them to curb their voracious appetite for these beautiful man-made icebergs in the casinos with the polar bears playing on them, and other wonders of recreated nature for the amusement of those of us visiting Las Vegas. But in western Texas, land prices have gone to an all-time low because the Ogallala Aquifer, which starts up in North Dakota and runs under 8 central states, where many farmers are dependent upon regional groundwater supplies to irrigate land for farming. That Ogallala Aquifer is at a precarious level, and in western Texas, farmers are now hard-pressed finding enough water to be able to continue farming. In closer to home, in Georgia, Alabama, and northern Florida, despite the current phenomenon that went through Alabama and hit Florida and came on up here, we are still 30% lower than any regional groundwater table has ever been seen before. And primarily that is bad planning. No one ever envisioned that Atlanta was going to become a megalopolis of close to 10 million people, all of them dependent upon the same freshwater supply that the people of northern Florida and Alabama are dependent upon. And so when those water supplies are drawn down to a perilous level, water rationing is going to step in. And in St. Petersburg and Tampa, Florida now, they're experimenting with alternative energy resources. They've gotten permission from the Environmental Protection Agency to pump 50 million gallons of salt water out of the Gulf and purify that through a process called desalination. The problem is it's so expensive that the people that undertook the project have gone bankrupt, and the plant has not yet become operational. The vision for the future is that 34 million gallons of fresh water would be distributed to the 5-county citizens of that part of Florida, residents, and they would sell 1,000 gallons of clean water for $1.50 1,000 gallons. Those of you that have gone over to the Student Union and have recently bought an 8-ounce bottle of Evian will remember that figure of $1.50 for 1,000 gallons of clean, pure water when you pay $1.50 for an 8-ounce bottle of Evian. No wonder Evian backwards is spelled naive. So the water crisis is very real, and alternatives are going to have to be found, including becoming conservationists, finding toilets that flush with 3 gallons. I was recently at the University of California, Long Beach, and I was amazed by signs in all of the men's toilets. I assume the ladies' rooms had the same thing, but over the urinals it said, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. Trying to conserve water, and it's what happens when you get into water-stressed areas where you don't take the kind of luxury that we have in having the ability to brush our teeth with the water running during the entire process, or taking 20-minute showers after a lacrosse game. That feels so good on relaxing muscles, but believe me, you all will find that water will become one of our most precious resources. What are the solutions? Very quickly in the remaining time, because I want to save some time for questions and answers. One is to eradicate female illiteracy. We have found through empirical studies that wherever a woman has achieved an 8th grade education, she has half the number of pregnancies than her uneducated sisters. Number 2, and by the way, there are 600 million women today in the world. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization estimates have never seen the inside of a classroom. So obviously they're the ones that are greatest sufferers of poverty. Number 2 is full employment opportunities with pay for women. Men always find work. It may not be desirable work. It may not be work in their traditional homelands. They may have to move further away in order to find work. But men have always found work. Women as mothers are sort of locked to the home, locked to the family, and are unable to have that mobility that men are often afforded. But where they are able to participate in micro-enterprise, in cottage industries, in income-generating activities, they complete their desired family size much earlier in life. They become a more valuable voice in the family and also in the community. And so full employment opportunities is something that all of the world has to address, and the International Labor Organization in Geneva is now charged with that mission. Also, one of the major interventions that can bring about an early voluntary stabilization of world population is the reduction of infant mortality to its lowest level. This year, UNICEF tells us 15 million children will die under the age of 1, most of them from preventable diseases. Now, here's someone talking about population to you and saying you want to save children's lives. Doesn't that contradict what my premise is? Absolutely not, because what we're seeing, especially in those parts where poverty is the most rampant and where disease is still killing all too many people, you're seeing compensatory pregnancy. The neighbor next door wanted 4 children, but 6 of them died in childbirth, and so they opt for more pregnancies in order to achieve their desired family size. I mentioned to you that the U.S. family size now is 2 children. When I started in population back in 1972, the average family in the world was 6 children per family. Today we're down to 3. And due to the advent of availability of the knowledge and access to affordable means to regulate fertility, and the advent of television, you'd be amazed what villages I've been to where even a black and white television set is available. And most of the shows are ones that you and I have discarded a long time ago. General Hospital, Bonanza, Dallas is playing, and the hills of Tibet, you know. And television has been a very powerful tool in teaching families that there are other alternative means than to being locked in poverty. And with that, of course, comes an aspiration bomb, and that contributes to the migration of people around the world. And the UN estimates that we now have 1 million migrants each year moving out of their traditional homelands. And some in the US would argue it's probably even larger, with about 2 million illegals entering into the United States. Given current growth rates, the United States will achieve probably today we have 300 million. We'll achieve 600 million by the year 2100, not as a result of births, but as a result of in-migration from the terribly poverty-stricken countries around the world that account for the biggest increase in population. 99% of the 77 million that were added last year were added in the poorest countries in the world. And number 4 of the solutions, lest you think I've forgotten my place, is the prevention of unintended pregnancy. From natural family planning for those for whom it works, to modern medically approved methods of family planning. And abortion is not a method of family planning. I don't know how long it takes for our politicians to realize that the best way to prevent abortion in the first place is to make sure that couples know how to prevent unintended pregnancies. Everything, as I said, from natural family planning. In this mesmerizing setting this morning at the Rotary Club over at the Country Club meeting, I had a man giggle when I mentioned natural family planning, so I had to go up to him afterwards, since he was one of the oldest Rotarians in the room, and I said, "What did I say that struck your funny bone?" And he looked at me and he said, "You know, Sonny, you look young enough that I think you'll learn in due time that natural family planning works best among sexually abstinent couples over 65. We should never be so arrogant as to suggest what method a couple should use, but I think we should all be committed to that basic human right that all the nations of the world have signed on to, that couples have the right to the information and access to the affordable means to control their fertility and regulate their family size." I thank you for paying attention to this unusual morning lecture. You didn't know what he was going to bring you, but I'm always delighted to see students who are worrying about the environment. Pretty soon you'll be the majority on campus, because all of us are going to have to come to grips with what kind of environment we're going to have for future generations. Thank you for having me. There's some materials over on the side table, including a pledge card which says that I'd like to donate 10 hours a year to educate our politicians about the importance of the environment, women's rights, and population stabilization through voluntary means. If you feel you can donate 10 hours in 1 year, not cash, the Institute is privately funded and was founded by the Methodist Church, and I'm the only one in Washington that has calluses on his knees from begging for donations. But this is not a donation request, it's a request for you to become involved in making a change in directions and in leadership in bringing about a more conscientious knowledge of the interrelationship between these issues. So take a green card in the back. And if you didn't know what this was all about, there's also a bumper sticker. And the bumper sticker says, "How dense can we get?" Yes, sir.
Would you talk about the U.S. policy of international population control and money that isn't being given to the UN?
It's not international population control money. As you heard me say at the beginning, the U.S. responds only to requests for help from other nations, and in no way does it get involved in any program that is involuntary or coercive. The issue on the current international scene is a decision on the part of the Bush administration to withhold for the third year in a row, the only nation in the world that's withholding funding for international family planning over allegations that China has force and coercion in its population program. China is now 1.3 billion people. It didn't realize that it had a population problem until it went over 800 million. At that time, it lost about 30 million to starvation and instituted a two-child family policy. And in the year 1980, it advocated a one-child policy. You notice it's not a law, it's a policy. But the UN Population Fund, which is prohibited by its own charter from getting involved in abortion in any way, provides China with medical expertise to find alternatives to methods of contraception that are more effective, that are safer, and that are more inexpensive. And because the UN provides $3.4 million to the billion-dollar Chinese program on population, the Bush administration, at the request of voodoo evangelists and the Vatican, has withdrawn support for the UNFPA. The Congress has voted overwhelmingly to reverse that decision. The president has again this year decided to withhold, even though his own task force that he sent to China, made up of 3 very distinguished career diplomats, reported back and said that the best alternative to more voluntary approaches in China is the presence of the UN in working with the Chinese government. And the Chinese government itself is very conscious. As I mentioned to you, I was in Wuhan last week as the keynote speaker of a 44-nation conference, and I was delighted to see that the Chinese government addressing the problems of infanticide. China is part of a string of countries that still prefer sons over daughters. And it's been estimated by Amnesty International that some 70 million girls have been lost in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and China in the last 10 years alone, simply because they were conceived as girls. And so mothers and their own relatives kill them when they're born because they argue that they have no value to their family life. China has now instituted a social security system whereby people will be paid $50 a month. That's small by our standards, but it's an enormous outlay when you realize that by the year 2010, China will have over 300 million over 65-year-olds. What that's going to cost in Social Security is staggering. But also, one of the other reforms is that if you're a parent who gives birth to a girl, you're going to get, until that girl is 18 years old, $50 a month as a government subsidy to raise that girl, to educate that girl, and to achieve equality between the genders. So I think China is moving in the right direction. I would like to see more vigorous pursuit of people who violate the law that says there shall be no forced abortion or forced sterilization. They have a law on the book, but I have not seen anyone prosecuted for violating that law. But we certainly are not being part of the world answer to these problems if we withdraw assistance from countries that no other nation has seen enough evidence or willingness to withdraw help from. The $25 million that the president withheld is a cheap sellout and a reprehensible retreat from reality. We'll be visiting it this next week. The Senate has just voted again to overturn the Bush edicts. This time they're giving him no slippery room, saying the money shall be made available. And the same thing also holds that none of these funds may be used in the People's Republic of China. So it's the 140 countries that are suffering around the world. There have no allegations of forced abortions or involuntary that are the ones that are suffering as a result of what China is being blamed for. Yes?
I heard a study that within this century, the world population is supposed to level out somewhere near 11 to 12 billion, and that the world can't sustain this. I was wondering if you could verify that.
Okay. You're quite right. The estimate at the United Nations now is that we will probably, if we continue as we're going now, that means that the 20 industrialized countries are going to continue to provide voluntary assistance to countries that are the poorest and are in need of Western technological help. If that's sustained, we're going to balance at about 8.9 billion. I think we can do that 8 billion if we empower the 350. That's why when she said control, if we just give the right, the basic right, and the access to affordable contraceptives of choice, then we're going to see achieving a much smaller family size. I mean, Mexico, that in 1972 had 7 children per family, is now down to 2.2. They will probably achieve a 2-child family norm within the next 10 years. Brazil, the largest Catholic country in the world, is now at 60% of its population using modern means of birth control. The problem is Brazil has 50% of its population under 15 years of age, and if they don't have the knowledge and the affordable means available to control their family life, they will be still looking at very staggering statistics. As far as sustainability is concerned, no major scientific or educational institution has been willing to undertake a study on what is the carrying capacity of this planet. Obviously, if we all consume as we do in the Western world, then we're already beyond carrying capacity. But if you consume, as so much of Asia, a bowl of rice and a brown water, then we probably could sustain, as we're going to have to, the 8 billion that are going to come and join us because of the number of under 24-year-olds that you saw demonstrated at the beginning of my talk. Even if you only have one child, and there are a billion of you, and you only have one child each, you're going to add an enormous amount of population to this planet, and we're not dying. I mean, in the United States, we today have 30 million people on Social Security. By the year 2010, that figure is going to go to 100 million. And when you look at the issues facing our political scene, I don't hear anyone talking about who's going to pay for Social Security for 100 million potential recipients of Social Security within the next 6 years, just in the United States. So there are a lot of issues on the horizon that we're afraid to tackle, including costs of Medicare was established in 1964. When you go get your paycheck and you see there's a little box, I'm always amused by the number of boxes, and it isn't until you're 30 that you finally say, what are all these things that are cutting my paycheck in half? And you have one box there that says $5.14 for Medicare. That's your part of the contribution. Your employer pays the other part. But that price was set in 1964 when we didn't have hip transplants, knee transplants, heart transplants, Alzheimer's diseases, and everything else on the horizon, and a tremendous increase in cancer treatments. And so someone is going to have to pay for this increased medical cost. And with 40 million Americans without medical insurance altogether, we have a lot of issues out there that really call out for us to seriously look at this election. Yes?
Thank you for a wide-ranging and informative talk. Is there an effective counter-argument that the developed states in the North, industrialized states in the North, can make to developing states when they claim that, well, the developed North industrialized dirty, using dirty fuels? Why are you, it's a double standard to suggest that we adopt a different sort of profile. Is there an effective counter-argument?
Yes, we experienced the industrialized revolution at a time when there were only 1 billion people on this planet. You came in a little bit too late to hear the liturgy I gave of 1 billion by 1830. By 1930, 2 billion, 1963 billion, 1975, 4 billion, 1986, 5 billion, 1999, 6 billion. We're adding another billion every 12 years. And there just is not an equal increase in resources. With half of the world's population now existing on less than $2 a day, places like Tanzania and East Africa at 30 cents a day. There's no way that Tanzania can pull itself out of the tremendous trap of poverty that it finds itself in. In 1950, they had 5 million population. Today, they're at 40 million, and they're going to 80 million in the next 20 years. And so the counter-argument isn't really a counter-argument. It's being responsive. We're spending $400 billion in armaments, and even in countries where we have no conflict. I mean, if we all followed the example of Costa Rica, which did away in 1948 of the armed forces, all of them, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and devoted its resources to what now is 99% literacy, there isn't, it's a very small number that haven't graduated from high school in Costa Rica, boys and girls. And so the peace dividend that comes out of moving away from this massive arms race has got to be invested in human development. And the only argument that I can counter with when people say, and there are no countries, the fifth survey taken by the United Nations and just completed this year has every nation asking for help in coming to grips with balancing its population with its resources, and thereby getting a boost from what is a population dividend. But the Asian tigers have experienced it. They were able to see a significant boost as a result of their significant reduction in fertility. But you have countries, Thailand as an example, has seen a 67% decline in fertility. And, but, you know, each society has to do what's culturally acceptable. I went to Bangkok not too long ago, and on my last day, I said, what's the best restaurant in town? And I was told it's Condom and Cabbages. And I obviously had to repress my smile, and I went to Condoms and Cabbages that night and had a wonderful meal. And when I checked out at the cash register, there were 3 baskets in front of the register. Instead of mints and toothpicks, they had condoms, a basket marked small, a basket marked medium, and a basket marked large. And it tells you what liars those guys are. The large basket was always empty, even though Thai's anatomy is not really anything to compare with what may happen in the European or Western setting. But they have really gone about it. Even on the king's birthday, he issued a decree that everyone in Thailand who had a vasectomy, voluntary vasectomy, was invited to the king's birthday party. So many people presented vasectomy certificates to the health department that they had to move the king's birthday party to the biggest soccer stadium in Bangkok. So either they're all party animals, or Thai men are taking the message to heart to be responsible fathers. Thank you very much, everybody.